Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The smell of fish sauce in the land of strangers. What if I told you that the secret to breaking down the hardest wall in your life isn't a therapy session, a heated argument, or even a perfectly pronounced English sentence, but a single, stinky, amber-colored bottle of fish sauce that you bought for $3 at a dusty Asian grocery store in the middle of Ohio? Before you click away thinking this is another boring grammar lesson, stop right there. Because this video is not about memorizing verb conjugations or practicing tongue twisters until you pass out. This is a video about the moment you realize that your English is not a test score, your accent is not a flaw, and your identity is not a barrier. It is your superpower. And if you are watching this right now, sitting in your room, feeling that familiar knot in your stomach because you have been trying to learn English for months, maybe years, and you still feel like an outsider in your own life, I need you to take a deep breath and listen carefully because I was you. I was the one who cried in the supermarket parking lot because I couldn't understand the cashier's question about paper or plastic. I was the one who smiled and nodded while my mother-in-law said something that I knew, in my gut, was a criticism about my cooking, my culture, or my very existence. I was the one who wanted to give up, pack my bags, and fly back to a place where the food smelled like home and the language didn't make my brain feel like it was short-circuiting. But here's the twist that no English teacher ever told me. I didn't learn English by studying harder. I learned it by cooking. I learned it by fighting for my marriage and watching the most stubborn wall in America crumble, one spoonful at a time. So, if you are feeling that deep, aching exhaustion right now, the kind that makes you want to delete every language app on your phone and just give up on the American dream entirely, this story is for you. Because the problem is not your brain. The problem is not your vocabulary. The problem is that you're trying to learn English like a robot, but you are a human being with a heart, a history, and a smell of fish sauce that your mother used to drizzle over hot rice. And that, my friend, is exactly what will save you. This is a true story about a girl from a small coastal village in Vietnam who landed in the freezing suburbs of Michigan, fell in love with a blue-eyed engineer who could barely eat noodles with chopsticks, and found herself trapped between two worlds that seemed completely incompatible. Her husband loved her, but his mother was a different story. She was a retired schoolteacher with perfect grammar, perfect posture, and a perfect recipe for meatloaf that she had been making for 40 years. She looked at this tiny Asian girl with her loud laughter and her strange-smelling lunchboxes, and she saw a threat. She saw a foreigner who would never understand her son, never understand her country, and never, ever understand the proper way to set a table. The first Thanksgiving dinner was a disaster. I tried to make a traditional Vietnamese dish to share, a caramelized fish clay pot that my grandmother taught me, and the moment I opened the lid, the entire room went silent. The children pinched their noses. The uncles coughed. And my mother-in-law, with a frozen smile that could have chilled a glass of iced tea, said, "Oh, how aromatic." That word, aromatic, was the dagger that started the war. From that day on, every meal was a battlefield. Every conversation was a minefield. She would correct my English in front of her friends, not to help me, but to humiliate me. She would say, "It's she makes, not she make, honey. Don't you learn anything in those classes?" And I would smile and nod, and I would go back to my room and cry into my pillow, wondering why I had ever left my family, my food, and my language just to be treated like a child. The worst part was, my husband didn't see it. He saw a kind mother and a loving wife, and he assumed that all women just needed to have a nice chat over coffee. He didn't understand that this was not a misunderstanding, it was a power struggle. And the language barrier was the weapon she used to keep me in my place. She would speak faster when she knew I was struggling. My English classes were useless. They taught me how to order a burger, but they didn't teach me how to defend my dignity. But they didn't teach me how to explain to my mother-in-law why my ancestors' cooking was the most beautiful thing in the world. I lost my motivation. I stopped speaking English at home. I retreated into silence. I became a ghost in my own house, cooking meals that nobody appreciated, speaking words that nobody wanted to hear. And that is when I hit rock bottom. I remember sitting on the kitchen floor at 2 a.m., holding a jar of fish sauce that I had smuggled in my luggage from Vietnam, and I thought, this is ridiculous. I am a grown woman, and I am crying over a condiment. But it wasn't the fish sauce I was crying about. It was the loneliness. It was the fear that my children, who were growing up speaking English, would never really know me. It was the terror that my husband, who loved me, would eventually get tired of translating every argument. I wanted to give up. I wanted to go home. But then something clicked. I remembered my grandmother's words. She used to say, "Food is the language that doesn't need translation." You don't need perfect verbs to make someone feel loved. You just need to feed them. And in that moment, I made a crazy decision. I decided I was going to stop trying to beat my mother-in-law at her own game. I wasn't going to compete with her meatloaf. I wasn't going to fight her with arguments. I was going to fight her with flavor. I was going to use that stinky, magical, fermented fish sauce to break down the wall between us, even if it meant standing in that kitchen for 100 years. But to do that, I had to start speaking again. I had to stop being afraid of making mistakes. I had to realize that this wasn't about grammar, it was about communication. My mother-in-law didn't care about my perfect past perfect. She cared about respect. She cared about tradition. And if I could show her that my tradition was just as rich and powerful as hers, maybe, just maybe, she would see me not as a foreigner, but as a daughter-in-law. This is where the real lesson of language learning comes in. Science tells us that emotional engagement is the engine of memory. When we feel threatened or rejected, our brains go into survival mode and stop processing new information effectively. But when we feel safe, fed, and connected, our brains open up like a flower. By putting myself in a high-stakes emotional situation, cooking for a critical mother-in-law, I was actually forcing my brain to learn English in the most natural way possible. I had to learn the names of herbs, the names of spices, the adjectives to describe the texture and taste of my cooking. I had to learn polite requests and gentle arguments. I stopped taking notes from a textbook and started taking notes from her reactions. Every time she frowned, I learned a new word for too salty. Every time she smiled, I learned a new way to describe perfect balance. This is the method you need to adopt. Don't learn English to pass a test. Learn English to tell a story that matters. Learn English to defend the people you love. Learn English to explain why your mother's soup is better than anyone else's. The moment you attach your language learning to a powerful, personal why, the vocabulary will stick to you like honey. You won't forget it because it's not just a word. It's a weapon, a shield, or a bridge. So I took my fish sauce, I took my courage, and I walked into that kitchen. I told my husband, I am hosting a dinner. Only for your mother. And I am not translating. I am going to speak to her in my broken, slow English, and she is going to listen. He thought I was crazy. He thought I was going to start World War III in his family. But I knew better. I knew that the smell of garlic frying in oil, the sizzle of fish dropping into hot caramel, and the steam rising from a pot of rice are universal languages. And if I could add a few slow, carefully chosen English words to that symphony, words like love, home, grandma, and sorry, I might just survive. This is the beginning of my story. It is not a story about perfect pronunciation. It is a story about perfect intention. And it is a story that ends not with a divorce, not with a breakdown, but with a dinner table where my mother-in-law finally asked me, "How did you make this taste so familiar?" So if you are watching this and feeling that overwhelming urge to quit, remember my fish sauce. Remember that one small, smelly, humble ingredient can change the entire chemistry of a relationship. And your broken, slow, imperfect English is the most beautiful ingredient you have. Now let's go to the next part of this journey, where I actually landed in America and discovered that the biggest earthquake wasn't the weather, it was the silence inside my own head. Do not close this video. Stay with me. The best part, the cooking, the crying, and the victory, is just around the corner. And I promise you, by the end of this story, you will never look at a bottle of fish sauce the same way again. Landing in America, the first cultural earthquake. Now close your eyes for just a second and imagine this. You've spent the last 24 hours inside a pressurized metal tube. Your legs are cramping, your mouth tastes like recycled airplane air, and you have just survived a 13-hour flight where the only thing to eat was a small, rubbery piece of chicken that looked like it had been cooked in a laboratory, and you finally step off the plane, expecting to feel relief. But instead, the first breath you take feels like someone has just shoved a handful of ice cubes straight down your throat. Because you have just arrived in Michigan in the middle of January, and your body, which has only ever known the warm, sticky, comforting embrace of a Vietnamese tropical climate, is now experiencing a level of cold that you did not even know existed on this planet. And within 30 seconds, you realize that every single American movie you have ever watched has lied to you about winter. Because nobody told you that the cold does not just sit on your skin, it attacks you. It bites your nose. It makes your ears feel like they're going to crack and fall off. And you're standing in the middle of Detroit Metropolitan Airport wearing a flimsy little jacket that you bought at a market in Saigon because you thought it looked very fashionable, and you're shivering so violently that your teeth are chattering like castanets, and the customs officer, a big, burly man with a thick mustache and absolutely no sympathy in his eyes, looks at your passport, looks at your shivering, pathetic face, and says in a monotone voice, "Welcome to the United States," and you try to say thank you, but all that comes out is a weird, chattering squeak. And he just grunts and waves you through, probably thinking to himself, "This poor soul is not going to survive the parking lot." And honestly, you're not sure if you will survive the parking lot either, because as you walk out of the terminal and the glass doors slide open, that freezing wind hits you with the force of a physical slap, and you have to grab onto the handrail just to stay upright, and your fiancé, the sweet American man who has been waiting for you with a bouquet of roses that are already wilting in the cold, looks at you with such pure, innocent excitement and says, "So, what do you think of America?" And you look at him, your lips turning blue, your brain barely functioning, and you think, "I think America is a frozen wasteland designed to kill me." But instead, you force a frozen, painful smile and whisper, "Is very." The car ride from the airport to the small, gray, depressing apartment that your fiancé has rented for you is a blur of white snow, identical houses, and a silence so loud that it rings in your ears like a persistent, annoying bell, because this is not the America you have seen in movies, where the streets are empty, the lawns are perfectly manicured, and the only sounds are the crunch of snow under tires and the occasional howl of what you hope is a dog, but could also be a wolf. And you press your face against the cold glass of the window, and you feel this profound, suffocating loneliness. A feeling that sits in your chest like a heavy stone, because back home, there was never silence. There was always the honking of motorbikes, the laughter of neighbors, the sizzle of street food vendors, the constant, chaotic, beautiful symphony of human life. But here, there is just empty, endless, snow-covered nothing, and you wonder if you have made a terrible mistake, if you have traded the vibrant chaos of your home for this cold, quiet prison, and a tiny, rebellious part of your brain whispers, you can still go back, you can still run away, you do not have to do this. But then you look at your fiancé, who is so happy, so hopeful, so unaware of the existential crisis happening in your head. You will become an American, even if it kills you, which, given the temperature, seems like a very real possibility. The first week in that apartment was a comedy of errors that would have been hilarious if it had not been so utterly humiliating. I remember walking into a supermarket for the first time, a massive, brightly lit cathedral of consumerism called Meijer, and being completely, paralyzingly overwhelmed by the sheer, absurd abundance of everything. There were 50 different kinds of cereal, 100 varieties of soda, an entire aisle dedicated to potato chips, which, by the way, is an insane thing to dedicate an entire aisle to, and I was looking for lemongrass. A simple, basic ingredient that you can find on every street corner in Vietnam for about 50 cents. And I walked up and down the vegetable section 5 times, scanning every single shelf, but all I could find were sad, wilted bundles of something called leeks and massive, terrifying cabbages that looked like they could survive a nuclear apocalypse. And so I finally built up the courage to ask a worker, a very large, very cheerful man whose name tag said Gary and who clearly had not had a bad day in his entire life. And I said, in my broken, stuttering English, "Excuse me, sir, where's the lemongrass?" And Gary looked at me with a blank, uncomprehending smile and said, "Lemons? They're on aisle 3 with the fruit," and I shook my head frantically and tried to explain, No, is not lemon, is grass, is lemongrass. For cooking, for soup, and I was miming the motion of chopping. I was practically performing a one-woman play in the middle of the vegetable section, and Gary just scratched his head and said, "Huh? I don't think we have that, ma'am. Have you tried the Asian market on the other side of town?" And frantic foreign woman who was acting like she was looking for a rare and precious artifact, and I mumbled a quiet, defeated thank you and scurried away, trying to disappear into the frozen food aisle, where I stood in front of a massive freezer full of ice cream and fought back tears, because I couldn't even buy a simple herb in this country. How was I ever going to build a life here? And that feeling, that soul-crushing, humiliating incompetence, is what most people don't understand about learning English in America. It is not just about vocabulary and grammar, it is about the constant, daily, grinding humiliation of being treated like a child, like someone who cannot manage the simple, basic tasks of adult life, like someone who is not quite smart enough, not quite capable enough to exist in this fast-paced, competent, English-speaking world. My fiancé's family, especially his mother, made me feel this inadequacy every single day, not with overt cruelty, but with tiny, subtle, devastating microaggressions that accumulated in my heart like pebbles in a landslide. She would ask me, very slowly, loudly, and patronizingly, "Can you say thank you?" As if I were a toddler learning my first words. Or she would correct my pronunciation of simple words like spaghetti and hamburger in front of the entire family, and everyone would go quiet. And I would feel that familiar heat rising to my cheeks, and I would just smile and nod and say, "Thank you for helping me." Because I had learned that arguing, defending myself, or explaining my culture would only make things worse. Because she didn't want to understand me. She wanted to dominate me. She wanted to prove that her world, her language, her food, and her way of life were superior to mine. And the worst part was that sometimes, in my darkest, most exhausted moments, I started to believe her. Started to think that maybe she was right. Maybe I was just a clueless foreigner who would never fit in. And I would lock myself in the bathroom and cry silently, pressing a towel to my mouth so no one could hear me. Because crying in a language you don't understand is just another layer of loneliness, a loneliness that has no words, no vocabulary, no translation. But the universe, in its strange, unpredictable way, has a funny sense of humor, because just when you are about to give up, just when you are about to pack your bags and disappear back into the tropical warmth of your homeland, it sends you a tiny, unexpected lifeline. And for me, that lifeline was a simple, cheap, dusty bottle of fish sauce that I finally found at a tiny Asian grocery store. A grimy little hole-in-the-wall crammed between a laundromat and a nail salon, and when I walked into that store and smelled the familiar, pungent aroma of fermented fish, dried shrimp, and exotic spices, I felt like I was coming home. Like I had found a secret portal back to my mother's kitchen, and I bought every single bottle of fish sauce they had, along with a bag of jasmine rice, a bundle of fresh herbs, and a small jar of chili paste. And I carried them back to my gray apartment like precious treasures, and I stood in that tiny, unfamiliar kitchen, surrounded by appliances I didn't recognize and measuring cups that made no sense to my metric-trained brain. And I started cooking the one thing I knew how to do better than anyone, the one thing that required no translation, no grammar, no perfect pronunciation. I cooked my grandmother's caramelized fish clay pot, and the moment that fish hit the hot pan, the moment that sweet, savory. I may not speak your language perfectly, but I can cook, and my cooking is a language that everyone understands, and that realization, as simple and silly as it sounds, was the spark that would eventually ignite the fire that melted my mother-in-law's frozen heart. There is actual science behind this feeling, by the way. Neuroscientists have discovered that smell is the sense most directly connected to memory and emotion because the olfactory bulbs are part of the limbic system, the ancient, primitive part of your brain that handles feelings and memory, which means that the smell of your mother's cooking, the smell of fish sauce and garlic and caramelized sugar, hits your brain harder and faster than any perfectly pronounced English sentence ever could. And that is why I decided, right there in that tiny, depressing American kitchen, that I was going to stop fighting the language war with grammar books and vocabulary lists, and I was going to fight it with flavor. I was going to overwhelm my mother-in-law's senses with smells and tastes that she had never experienced. I was going to make her so curious, so intrigued, so hungry, that she would have no choice but to come to my table, sit down and listen, and in the next section, we will finally meet the man who made all of this possible, the American engineer with blue eyes and a terrible chopstick technique. The man who fell in love with me not despite my broken English, but because of it, because he saw my struggles as passion and my accent as poetry. And he taught me that you don't have to speak perfectly to be perfectly understood. You just have to be brave enough to open your mouth and say something that matters. So if you're sitting there right now, feeling that same cold, lonely, hopeless feeling that I felt in that gray Michigan apartment, please know that this is not the end of your story. It is the messy, beautiful, painful beginning, and the cold will pass, the loneliness will fade, and one day, you will look back at this moment and realize that the hardest part of your journey was also the part that made you the strongest. And your broken English, your strange accent, and your weird, stinky fish sauce are not weaknesses. They are the secret weapons that will help you conquer the world, one slow, careful, and delicious sentence at a time. Meet him, a ray of light in loneliness. Now, let me tell you about the moment everything changed, the moment that tiny, cold, gray apartment in Michigan suddenly felt like it had a heartbeat, because one evening, when I was sitting on the floor surrounded by unpacked boxes, feeling so utterly alone that I thought my chest might actually cave in from the weight of it, my fiancé came home with a friend, a man who would completely redefine everything I thought I knew about America, about love. and about the possibility of being understood without having to speak perfectly. And when I opened the door to see this tall, slightly awkward, blue-eyed engineer standing behind my fiancé, holding a six-pack of beer that he had clearly bought as a peace offering because he had heard from my fiancé that I was feeling a little homesick, I could not have predicted that this man, this complete stranger with a gentle smile and the kindest eyes I had ever seen, would become the anchor that kept me from drifting away into the sea of despair, because he looked at me, not at my accent, not at my strangeness, not at my obvious discomfort, but at me, the real me, the woman who was terrified and brave and confused and hopeful all at the same time, and he said, "I've always wanted to try Vietnamese food. Would you teach me how to cook someday?" And I remember standing there, frozen, my brain short-circuiting, because I had prepared myself for judgment, for condescension, for that horrible patronizing tone that Americans sometimes use when they talk to foreigners. But instead, this man was asking me to teach him something. He was treating me like an expert, like someone who had value and knowledge and wisdom. And for the first time since I had stepped off that airplane into the freezing Michigan winter, I felt a tiny, fragile spark of hope flicker to life in my chest, and I looked at him, my eyes probably wide with surprise, and I whispered, "Yes, I teach you. My cooking is terrible. We'll be a perfect team. You can use your hands to show me what to do. I'm a visual learner anyway." And in that moment, I realized that this man was not just kind, he was brilliant, which is that language is not just about words. It is about intention. It is about patience. It is about creating a safe space where the other person feels seen and heard and valued, regardless of how many grammar mistakes they make. And from that night forward, Tom and I became unlikely cooking partners, spending hours in that tiny, cramped kitchen, chopping vegetables and simmering broths and laughing at our mutual failures because I would try to explain something in my broken English, and he would misunderstand and add too much fish sauce or not enough sugar, and we would taste the result and make identical, horrified faces. And then we would double over laughing, and in those moments of shared laughter, I realized that I was learning English faster than I had ever learned it in any classroom. Not because I was studying harder, but because I was having fun, because I was engaged, because I was using the language to do something I actually cared about. And that is the scientific secret that nobody tells you about language acquisition. Your brain is not a machine that processes vocabulary like data. It is a living, emotional organ that learns best when it is having a good time. And studies have shown that positive emotions actually enhance your ability to remember new words and grammatical structures because the hippocampus, which is the part of your brain responsible for memory, works much better when it is flooded with dopamine, the feel-good neurotransmitter, which means that laughing while you learn is not a distraction. It is a strategy, and a very effective one at that. As Tom and I cooked together, we started talking about everything and nothing, about our families, our dreams, our fears, and our deepest, most embarrassing secrets, and I realized that he was not just a nice guy. He was a genuinely good person who had grown up in a conservative, traditional American family, the kind of family where emotions are kept bottled up and conversations are polite but shallow. And he had always felt like a bit of an outsider himself because he was sensitive, introspective, and deeply curious about the world beyond the suburban bubble he had grown up in. And when he met me, this loud, expressive, passionate Vietnamese woman who wore her heart on her sleeve and cried openly when she tasted a dish that reminded her of her mother, he felt like he had finally found someone who understood the secret language of emotion that he had been longing for his entire life. And I realized, with a jolt of pure, electric excitement, that this man was not falling in love with me despite my broken English and my foreignness. He was falling in love with me because of it. Because my accent was a reminder of the world beyond his experience. Because my mistakes were endearing and honest. And that realization gave me a courage I had never known, a courage to speak more, to stumble more, to be more myself without apologizing for it. And I started telling him stories about my childhood in Vietnam, about the street vendors who sold banh mi on every corner, about the monsoon rains that flooded the streets and turned the city into a giant, splashing playground, about my mother's kitchen, which was the heart and soul of our home, and I told these stories in my slow, imperfect English, and Tom listened with such rapt attention, such genuine fascination, that I felt like I was speaking poetry, and he started asking questions, hundreds of questions, and I would answer them as best I could, often using hand gestures and drawings and even acting out entire scenes when I couldn't find the right words. And he never laughed at me, never corrected me, never made me feel stupid. He just nodded and smiled and encouraged me to keep going, and my English improved by leaps and bounds. Not because I was memorizing vocabulary lists, but because I was using the language to build a bridge between two worlds, two hearts, two cultures. And that bridge was going to lead to something beautiful, something powerful, something that would shock everyone, especially his mother. Of course, the irony of the whole situation is that while Tom and I were falling in love over steaming pots of pho and fragrant bowls of curry, his mother was completely unaware, or perhaps she was aware and completely horrified, because in her mind, her son was supposed to marry a nice American girl from a good family, someone who would fit seamlessly into their Christmas traditions and their Sunday roasts and their polite, predictable dinner conversations. And instead, he was spending every single night in a tiny apartment with a foreign woman who smelled like garlic and fish sauce and talked about things like ancestors and spirits and karma, things that made absolutely no sense to her logical, practical, Midwestern mind. And I could feel her disapproval radiating through the phone every time Tom talked to her. And I could see it in the way she stiffened whenever I came up in conversation, and I knew, with a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, that this woman was going to be the biggest obstacle I would ever face, because she was not just a mother-in-law, and she held the keys to a kingdom that I might never be allowed to step foot in. But here is the thing about falling in love with someone who believes in you, someone who sees your potential even when you cannot see it yourself, someone who whispers in your ear, "You are enough, exactly as you are, broken English and all." It changes you at a cellular level. It gives you a resilience that you did not know you possessed. It makes you willing to fight for your happiness even when the odds seem insurmountable. And Tom became my champion, my cheerleader, my safe harbor in the storm of American culture, and he told me, over and over again, "My mother will come around. She just needs time. She just needs to see how amazing you are. She just needs to taste your cooking." And when he said that, I laughed, because his mother would rather eat a plate of raw broccoli than taste my fish sauce. But deep down, in that secret, hopeful part of my heart that refused to give up on the American dream, I thought, maybe he is right. Maybe food really can build bridges. Maybe my grandmother's recipes are not just sustenance. They are diplomacy, they are love letters, they are weapons of mass connection, and maybe, just maybe, I can use them to break through the hardest wall in this country. The science of this is actually fascinating, which reduces stress and increases feelings of trust and connection, which means that if I could just get my mother-in-law to sit at my table and eat my food, her body would literally betray her hostility and start producing chemicals that made her like me, whether she wanted to or not. And that sneaky, subversive, biological reality gave me the hope I needed to keep fighting, to keep cooking, to keep speaking my slow, imperfect English, to keep believing that love could conquer even the deepest cultural divide. And eventually, after months of secret cooking lessons and whispered conversations and nights spent dreaming about our future together, Tom got down on one knee in that very same kitchen, surrounded by the smell of garlic and fish sauce and the warm, familiar chaos of our shared culinary experiments, and he asked me to marry him, and I said yes. Not because I was sure I could win over his mother or conquer the language barrier or survive another Michigan winter, but because I was sure about him, because he had shown me that love was a language that transcended grammar. That connection was a force that could overcome any obstacle, and that my broken, beautiful, imperfect English was not a barrier to happiness, but a bridge to a life I had never even dared to dream of. And in the next section, and the real battle with my mother-in-law begins, but for now, I want you to take this lesson with you. The right person, the right environment, and the right motivation can transform your language learning journey from a painful chore into a joyful adventure. And if you are out there struggling, feeling like you will never be good enough, never sound American enough, never fit in, just remember that the people who truly matter will love you for your heart, not your grammar. And your accent is not a flaw. It is the music of your history, the melody of your homeland, and the most authentic, beautiful sound you will ever make. So keep speaking, keep stumbling, keep trying, because every word you say is a step closer to the life you deserve. The wedding and the whispers from the mother-in-law. Now, let me take you to the moment that every girl dreams about, the moment that is supposed to be the happiest day of her life. But for me, that day was a strange, intoxicating cocktail of joy and terror, because I was about to marry the man I loved, the man who had seen me at my most broken and had loved me anyway, but I was also about to officially become a part of a family that had made it very, very clear that I was not welcome. And the whispers had already started, like a low, constant hum in the background of every conversation. Every phone call, every family gathering, whispers that said things like, "She's not really one of us, is she?" And "I just don't think she understands our values." And "How is she going to raise children when she can barely speak English?" And those whispers were not just words, they were poison, dripping slowly into my husband's ear, trying to erode his confidence in me, trying to make him doubt the decision he had made to spend his life with a foreign woman, and I could see the strain on his face. The way he would get quiet after talking to his mother, the way he would hold me a little tighter at night, as if he was afraid that the weight of her disapproval would eventually tear us apart, and I knew, with a sinking, heavy certainty, that our wedding day was going to be a battlefield, not a celebration. And I was going to have to fight for my place in this family with every weapon I had, even if the only weapon I had was a jar of fish sauce and a stubborn refusal to give up. The engagement period was a nightmare of passive-aggressive emails, awkward phone calls, and carefully worded suggestions that were really just subtle insults dressed up in the polite language of Midwestern kindness. For example, my mother-in-law, whose name is Margaret, sent me an email that said, "Dear future daughter-in-law, I was thinking that maybe for the wedding reception, we could have a traditional American menu instead of anything too exotic, just so that all the guests feel comfortable." And I read that email 3 times, my hands shaking with a rage that I was not allowed to express. Because what she was really saying was, "Your food is weird and strange, and I don't want my friends to be embarrassed by it." And I wanted to respond with a passionate, angry email defending the culinary traditions of my ancestors. But instead, I took a deep breath and typed back, "Of course, Margaret. I understand completely. I will make sure the menu is very comfortable for everyone," because I had learned through months of painful experience that fighting her directly was like fighting a hurricane. You cannot win, you can only survive, and you have to be smart and strategic and patient. And I had a plan, a secret, beautiful, delicious plan that I was keeping hidden in my heart like a precious gem, and the plan was this. I would let her have her perfect American wedding. I would let her have her meatloaf and her mashed potatoes and her boring, beige casserole. But at the rehearsal dinner, the night before the wedding, when all the family was together and the wine was flowing and the emotions were high, I would serve my grandmother's caramelized fish clay pot, and I would watch her face as she tasted it, and I would know, once and for all, whether there was any hope of ever winning her over, and if she rejected it, if she rejected me, then I would know that there was nothing I could ever do to please her, and I would stop trying, stop fighting, stop hoping, and I would just focus on building my life with Tom, even if that meant building it far away from his mother's cold, judgmental shadow. The wedding planning process was a masterclass in cultural negotiation because every decision, from the flowers to the music to the color of the bridesmaids' dresses, became a symbolic battleground where two completely different worldviews clashed in a spectacular, exhausting collision. Margaret wanted white roses and classical string music and a traditional white cake with buttercream frosting. And I wanted orchids and Vietnamese love songs and a 3-tiered cake with passion fruit filling, and Tom, sweet, wonderful, completely overwhelmed Tom, just wanted everyone to get along. So he would look at me with those big, desperate blue eyes and say, "Can we just compromise? Can we just make everyone happy?" And I would grit my teeth and nod and agree to yet another compromise. And after a while, I started to realize that compromise did not mean meeting in the middle. It meant giving up everything I wanted so that Margaret could have everything she wanted, and I was slowly, painfully, being erased from my own wedding, my own identity, my own story, and that is when I finally understood that I had been going about this all wrong, that I had been trying to fit into her world, her culture, her expectations, but I had never once asked her to step into mine, and that realization, that lightning bolt of clarity, gave me the courage to stand up for myself, to put my foot down, to say, this is my wedding too, and I deserve to have some of my traditions honored. And I called Margaret on the phone, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear my own voice. And I said, "Margaret, I have been thinking about the wedding, and I have decided that I want to serve one Vietnamese dish at the reception. Just one small dish as a way to honor my family and my culture, and I hope you can support me in this." And there was a long, terrible silence on the other end of the line, a silence that seemed to stretch on for hours. And then she said, in a voice that was clipped and cold and completely devoid of warmth, "Well, I suppose one dish won't hurt. But please make sure it doesn't have any strong smells." And I knew exactly what she meant because she meant fish sauce. She meant garlic. She meant all the beautiful, pungent, life-affirming aromas that had nourished my ancestors for generations. And in that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to serve the strongest smelling, most pungent, most gloriously fragrant Vietnamese dish I could possibly make. And I was going to serve it at my wedding, and if Margaret fainted from the smell, well, that would be her problem, not mine. The day of the wedding arrived, and I stood in front of the mirror in my white dress, my hair perfectly styled, my makeup flawless. And I walked down the aisle toward Tom, his eyes shining with tears of joy, his smile so wide it almost broke his face, and I thought, this is it. This is the moment I have been waiting for. This is the moment I become Mrs. Tom Miller. And we said our vows, our beautiful, heartfelt vows that we had written ourselves. And I promised to love him through sickness and health, through richer and poorer, through all the cultural clashes and mother-in-law dramas that life would throw at us, and he promised to love me for exactly who I was, accent and all. And when he kissed me, I felt a wave of pure, unadulterated happiness wash over me. A happiness so powerful that I almost forgot about the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. But then I looked over at Margaret, sitting in the front row with her perfect, frozen smile, and I knew that the real test was yet to come. The test that would determine whether this family could ever truly accept me, and that test was the reception. The moment when the guests would taste my cooking, The moment when Margaret would have to confront the reality that her son had married a woman who was not just foreign, but proudly, defiantly foreign. And I walked into that reception hall with my head held high, my heart pounding, and I saw the table where my Vietnamese dish was sitting, a beautiful, fragrant, caramelized fish clay pot that I had spent hours preparing. And I saw the guests eyeing it with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, and I saw Margaret approaching it, her face a mask of polite dread. And I held my breath as she lifted the lid, as the steam rose into the air, as the smell of fish sauce and garlic and caramelized sugar filled the entire room, and she looked at me, and I looked at her, and in that moment, the battle lines were drawn, and I knew that there was no going back, that this was the moment that would define our relationship forever. And I braced myself for the worst, for the rejection, for the cold, dismissive comment that I had heard 1,000 times before, but instead, something unexpected happened, something that I never could have predicted, something that would change everything. And that something was the beginning of the most unlikely friendship I have ever known, and I will tell you all about it in the next section. But for now, I want you to remember this: standing up for yourself, honoring your culture, and refusing to shrink yourself to make others comfortable is not an act of aggression. It is an act of self-love. And it is the most powerful thing you can do when you're trying to build a life in a new country. Because the people who truly love you will eventually come to appreciate the beauty of your differences. And the people who can't accept you for who you are were never going to be your real family anyway. First dinner, a tension like a tight string. Now, let me take you back to that reception hall, to the exact moment when the universe seemed to hold its breath. Because Margaret had just lifted the lid of my grandmother's caramelized fish clay pot, and the steam had risen into the air like a fragrant ghost, carrying with it the pungent, glorious, unmistakable aroma of fish sauce, garlic, caramelized sugar, and a lifetime of Vietnamese culinary tradition. And I watched her face with the intensity of a hawk watching its prey, searching for any flicker of emotion, any crack in that perfect, frozen mask of Midwestern politeness, and what I saw was something I had never seen before. Not disgust, not contempt, not the familiar condescension that I had grown so accustomed to, but something closer to confusion. A kind of bewildered curiosity that seemed to momentarily override her carefully constructed defenses, and she stood there, frozen, holding the lid in her hand, staring down at the bubbling, fragrant pot of fish and caramel and chilies, and for one glorious, terrifying second, I thought she might actually drop the lid and run screaming from the room, but instead, she did something that shocked me to my core. She took a deep, deliberate sniff, and I could see her nostrils flare slightly as the smell invaded her carefully controlled senses, and then she turned to me, her eyes meeting mine, and she said, in a voice that was quiet but not unkind, "Well, it certainly is distinctive," and I didn't know whether to laugh or cry because distinctive was not an insult, but it was certainly not a compliment, and yet there was something in her voice, something that sounded almost like respect, that gave me a tiny, fragile glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, this impossible woman was not entirely immune to the power of good food, and before I could respond, before I could even process what was happening, one of Margaret's friends, a cheerful, round woman named Carol who had already had 2 glasses of champagne, came bustling over to the table and said, "Oh my goodness, what is that amazing smell? It's like nothing I've ever smelled before. Is that Vietnamese food? I've always wanted to try Vietnamese food." And she grabbed a spoon and scooped up a generous portion of the fish and rice and shoved it into her mouth before anyone could stop her. And I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable gag, the horrified expression, the spitting out of the food into a napkin, but instead, Carol's eyes went wide, and she chewed slowly, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated pleasure, and she said, "Oh my God. This is the best thing I have ever eaten. What is in this? Is it magic? Are you a witch?" And she laughed and grabbed another spoonful, and suddenly, the floodgates opened, and a crowd of guests descended on my clay pot like hungry wolves, scooping and tasting and moaning with delight, and I stood there, completely stunned, watching as my grandmother's recipe, the same recipe that had been passed down through generations of strong, resilient Vietnamese women, the same recipe that had nourished my family through wars and famines and heartbreaking separations, was now being devoured with unabashed enthusiasm by a room full of American strangers, and I felt a tear roll down my cheek, because in that moment, I realized that food really was a universal language, a language that required no translation, no perfect grammar, no flawless pronunciation. Just the simple, profound act of sharing something that came from the heart, and I looked over at Margaret, expecting to see her looking horrified or offended, but instead, I saw her standing in the corner, watching the chaos unfold, her face unreadable, her arms crossed over her chest, and I could have sworn I saw the tiniest hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. A smile that disappeared the moment she realized I was looking at her, but I had seen it, and that tiny, fleeting smile was enough to fuel my hope for the next several months. However, I would be lying if I told you that one successful dinner was enough to magically fix everything, because the weeks and months that followed our wedding were some of the most challenging of my entire life, a relentless gauntlet of subtle slights, passive-aggressive comments, and the constant, exhausting work of trying to prove myself to a woman who seemed determined to see me fail. And every family dinner was a minefield, every holiday gathering a test of endurance, because Margaret had a unique talent for making me feel like an outsider in my own family, a talent that she wielded with surgical precision. And she would say things like, "Oh, you're making that fish thing again? I thought Americans ate turkey on Thanksgiving." Or, "I'm sure the children will be fine, but I do worry about their accents." Or, "Tom used to love my meatloaf, but I suppose now he has more exotic tastes." And each comment was a tiny, sharp knife that slid between my ribs and twisted, and I would smile and nod and say, "Thank you for your concern, Margaret," because I had learned that fighting back was useless, that defending myself only made me look defensive, that the only way to win this war was to be so relentlessly kind, so consistently gracious, so unshakably patient, that she would eventually have to admit that I was not the enemy, that I was just a woman who loved her son and wanted to be part of his family. And let me tell you, maintaining that level of grace when every fiber of your being wants to scream, "I am a human being with feelings and you are treating me like garbage," is one of the hardest things I have ever done, harder than learning English, harder than surviving the Michigan winter, harder than adapting to a culture that sometimes felt like it was designed to make me feel small. And there were nights when I would come home from these family dinners and just collapse into Tom's arms and sob, and he would hold me and stroke my hair and whisper, "I'm so sorry. I know she's difficult. I know it's not fair. But please don't give up. Please keep trying. I believe in you." And his belief in me, his unwavering faith in my ability to win this impossible battle, was the only thing that kept me going, because I knew that if I gave up, I would be giving up on us, on our family, on the future we were trying to build together. And I was not going to let Margaret win. I was not going to let her chase me back to Vietnam with her passive-aggressive comments and her frozen smiles. I was going to stand my ground and fight for my place in this family, even if it took 100 years, and in that determination, I found a strength I never knew I had, a strength that would eventually lead me to the most important cooking experiment of my life, the experiment that would finally break down the wall between Margaret and me, and that experiment was a quiet, unassuming dinner party that I hosted in my own home, a dinner party where I served nothing but the food of my ancestors, the food that had nourished my grandmother through war, and my mother through poverty, and me through the loneliness of exile. And I invited Margaret as the guest of honor, and I cooked with such love, such intention, such desperate hope, that I could almost feel my grandmother's spirit standing beside me in the kitchen, guiding my hands, whispering in my ear, "Don't be afraid, child. You are not alone. You carry the strength of 1,000 generations." And when Margaret arrived at my door, looking wary and uncomfortable, I welcomed her with a smile and a hug that I hoped conveyed my genuine desire for peace, and I sat her down at my table and served her a bowl of pho, the national dish of Vietnam, a simple, humble soup that had comforted my people for centuries, and I watched her lift her spoon, blow gently on the steaming broth, and take a sip. And I watched her face transform from suspicion to surprise to something that looked almost like wonder, and she looked at me, her eyes soft. And she said, This is really good, actually. What's in it?" And I laughed, because for the first time in our entire relationship, she had asked me a genuine question. A question that came from curiosity rather than judgment. A question that opened a door instead of slamming it shut. And I started explaining, slowly, carefully in my still imperfect English, the ingredients, the process, the history, the love, and she listened, really listened, with her head tilted and her eyes focused, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You know, I think I finally understand. This isn't just food. This is your whole history. This is your family. This is everything you are. And I've been so busy being afraid of the things I don't understand that I've been missing the most beautiful part of you." And I burst into tears. Because in that moment, the wall that had stood between us for so long, the wall of fear and misunderstanding and cultural ignorance, finally began to crumble, and I knew that we were not out of the woods yet. That there would still be challenges and disagreements and moments of tension, but something had shifted. Something had fundamentally changed. And that change was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where Margaret was no longer my enemy, but my ally. A chapter where we would learn from each other, teach each other, and eventually become the family we were always meant to be. Rifts grow when love is tested. Now, I know I left you on that beautiful note of hope, but let me be completely honest with you, because this story is not a fairy tale. And the reality of our relationship was far more complicated than a single magical bowl of soup, because the truth is that the initial thaw, that tiny crack in the ice, was not the end of the war, but merely a temporary ceasefire. A fragile pause and a conflict that would continue to simmer beneath the surface for months, testing my marriage, my sanity, and my unwavering belief that love could conquer all. And the real test came not from Margaret herself, but from the circumstances of daily life. The small, grinding, relentless challenges of raising children in a culture that was not my own, of navigating a marriage where two completely different worldviews were constantly colliding, and of trying to build a home in a country where I was perpetually, painfully aware that I was still an outsider, still learning, still stumbling, still making mistakes that reminded everyone around me that I did not truly belong. And the first major crack in our fragile peace came when I gave birth to my first child, a beautiful, perfect baby girl with her father's blue eyes and my mother's stubborn chin. Songs that had carried me through the darkest nights of my childhood, and I felt such a profound, overwhelming love for this child that I thought my heart might explode, but I also felt a deep, gnawing fear, because I knew that Margaret would have opinions about how I was raising her, opinions about what I was feeding her, opinions about the language I was speaking to her, and I was right because the very first time Margaret saw me singing to my daughter in Vietnamese, her face tightened into that familiar mask of disapproval, and she said, in a voice that was supposed to sound casual, but was dripping with judgment, "You know, it's really important for children to learn English early. You don't want her to have an accent, do you? She's an American girl, after all." And I felt a hot, furious rage surge through my body. A rage that I had to swallow down with every ounce of willpower I possessed, because what she was really saying was, "Your language is inferior. Your culture is a liability, and you are damaging your child by sharing it with her." And I wanted to scream. She is Vietnamese and American. She deserves to know both. She deserves to know her grandmother's language, the language of her ancestors, the language that has survived war and colonization and exile. But instead, I took a deep breath, forced a smile, and said, "I understand your concern, Margaret, but I believe that being bilingual is a gift, not a curse, and I want my daughter to have every gift I can possibly give her." And Margaret just pursed her lips and walked away. But I could feel her disapproval radiating from her like heat from a furnace, and I knew, with a sinking certainty, that this was just the beginning of a long, exhausting battle over how to raise my children, a battle that would test my marriage to its very limits. The conflicts over food, language, and child-rearing became the backdrop of our daily lives, a constant, low-level hum of tension that never quite disappeared, and Tom, my sweet, wonderful, conflict-averse husband, found himself caught in the middle, trying desperately to keep both his wife and his mother happy, which is an impossible task, because the demands of two strong-willed women from completely different cultures are fundamentally incompatible. And there were nights when he would come home from work looking exhausted and defeated, and he would collapse onto the couch and say, "Can we just have 1 week without a family drama? Just 1 week where nobody is fighting about food or language or how to burp the baby?" And I would feel a pang of guilt, because I knew that my refusal to back down, my insistence on honoring my culture, was making his life harder. But I also knew that I could not compromise my identity, could not erase my history, could not pretend to be someone I was not just to make his mother comfortable, and that fundamental, unshakable truth was the source of our deepest conflict, because Tom wanted peace, he wanted harmony, he wanted everyone to just get along. And I wanted respect, I wanted recognition, I wanted to be seen as an equal, not as a foreigner who needed to be assimilated into the dominant culture, and these two desires were like oil and water. They simply could not mix. And the stress of this constant, unresolved tension began to take a toll on our marriage, on our health, on my mental and emotional well-being. And I started to feel like I was drowning, like I was being slowly, painfully erased, like the woman I had been in Vietnam, the confident, capable, respected professional, was being replaced by this anxious, insecure, perpetually apologetic shadow of myself. And I hated it. I hated what I was becoming. I hated the way I would lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation with Margaret, analyzing every word, every gesture, every tiny slight, and wondering if I was imagining it all, wondering if I was being too sensitive, too paranoid, too foreign. And I started to doubt myself, to doubt my own perceptions, to wonder if maybe I really was the problem, if maybe I really was too loud, too emotional, too different, too much. And that doubt, that insidious, creeping self-doubt, was the most dangerous enemy I had ever faced, because it made me question everything, made me question whether I deserved to be happy, whether I deserved to be loved, whether I deserved to call this country my home. And I remember one night, after a particularly tense dinner at Margaret's house, where she had spent the entire evening criticizing my parenting, my cooking, and my accent. I came home and locked myself in the bathroom and just sat on the floor, my back against the cold tile wall, and I cried, not the gentle, quiet tears of sadness, but the ugly, heaving, gasping sobs of despair. The kind of crying that leaves you completely hollow and exhausted and wondering if you will ever feel whole again. And Tom knocked on the door, his voice soft and worried, and he said, "Honey, please open the door.
Please let me in. I'm so sorry.
I know this is hard. I know my mother is difficult. But please don't shut me out." And I wanted to open the door. I wanted to throw myself into his arms and let him carry me away from all of this. But I couldn't because I was so tired, so completely, utterly, bone-deep tired of fighting, tired of defending myself. Tired of being the one who always had to compromise, always had to be gracious, always had to be the bigger person, and I just wanted to disappear. To go back to Vietnam, to my mother's kitchen, to a place where I was understood without having to explain myself, where I was loved without having to prove my worth, and in that moment, the temptation to give up, to abandon this whole American experiment and go back to the familiar, comfortable chaos of my homeland was almost overwhelming, and I could feel myself slipping away from the hope that had sustained me for so long, and I thought, maybe Margaret is right. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe I was crazy to think I could make a life in a country that doesn't want me, and that thought, that dark, corrosive, poisonous thought, was the closest I ever came to giving up on my American dream. But then, just when I was about to surrender to the despair, I remembered something my mother had told me when I was a little girl, a piece of wisdom that had seemed silly at the time, but now felt like a lifeline. And she had said, when you are lost, when you don't know which way to go, you don't keep walking in circles. You stop. You sit down. You take a deep breath. And you listen to the voice of your ancestors. They know the way home. They have always known. And I closed my eyes and I listened, and in the silence of that cold, lonely bathroom, I heard my grandmother's voice. And she was saying, "You are stronger than you think. You are braver than you believe. And you are never, ever alone. We are with you, always. Now get up, wash your face, and go feed your family. They need you." And I took a deep, shuddering breath, and I got up, and I washed my face, and I opened the door, and I looked at Tom, my sweet, worried, desperate husband, and I said, "I am not going to give up. I am not going to let your mother win. I am going to fight for my family, for my children, for my place in this country, even if it takes me 100 years. And I am going to start by cooking a meal that will bring everyone together, a meal so delicious, so comforting, so undeniably magical, that even Margaret will have to admit that I am not just a foreigner. I am a daughter-in-law, a mother, a wife, and a force to be reckoned with." And Tom looked at me, his eyes shining with tears of relief and pride, and he said, "That's my girl. Now, let's go cook." And we did. We cooked together, just like we had in those early, hopeful days of our relationship. And the smell of garlic and fish sauce and caramelizing sugar filled our tiny kitchen, and for the first time in months, I felt a genuine smile spread across my face, a smile that came from deep inside, a smile that said, "I am still here, I am still fighting, and I am still believing that love can break down any wall." Despair to defeat, losing yourself. Now, I need to take you to the darkest place I have ever been, the place where hope dies and the only thing left is the cold, hard, suffocating weight of failure, because despite my brave words in the bathroom, despite my promise to fight for my family and my place in this country, the months that followed were some of the most soul-crushing of my entire life, and I found myself spiraling into a depression so deep, so all-consuming, that I started to wonder if I would ever find my way back to the surface. And The worst part was that I could not even explain it to Tom. Because how do you explain to someone who has never experienced it what it feels like to be slowly erased? To feel your identity crumbling like sand through your fingers? To wake up every morning and look in the mirror and not recognize the woman staring back at you? A woman who used to be confident and capable and respected. A woman who had a career and a community and a sense of purpose. And now she is just a foreign wife, a struggling mother, a perpetual student who cannot even string together a simple sentence without stumbling over her words. And the more I tried to fit in, the more I tried to be the perfect American wife, the perfect American mother, the perfect American daughter-in-law, the more I lost myself. Because I was constantly suppressing every instinct, every habit, every cultural trait that made me who I was, and in doing so, I was slowly, painfully killing my own soul, and I started to resent Tom, not because he was doing anything wrong, but because he was the symbol of everything I was sacrificing. He was the reason I was here, the reason I was struggling, the reason I was losing myself, and that resentment, that ugly, unfair, irrational resentment began to poison our marriage. Because I would snap at him for the smallest things, I would pick fights over nothing, I would retreat into sullen silence for days at a time. And he would look at me with those confused, hurt, desperate eyes and say, "What did I do wrong? What is happening to us?" And I would shrug and walk away, because I did not have the words to explain that I was drowning, that I was suffocating, that I was slowly disappearing, and the language barrier, that constant, exhausting, humiliating language barrier, was the rope around my neck. Because every time I tried to express my feelings, my fears, my frustrations, the words would get tangled up in my mouth. And I would sound like a child, a petulant, irrational child, and Tom, who was so patient and so kind, would try to help me. But his help felt like condescension, his patience felt like pity, and I hated him for it. I hated him for making me feel so small. Even though I knew it was not his fault, even though I knew he was trying his best, and the more I hated him, the more I hated myself. And the more I hated myself, the more I wanted to give up, to pack my bags, to disappear back to Vietnam, and admit that I had failed. That the American dream was not for me, that I was not strong enough, not smart enough, not good enough to make it in this country. And I started to withdraw from everything, from my friends, from my family, from my own children, because I was so ashamed of who I had become, so ashamed of my broken English, my strange accent, my weird food, my foreignness, that I could not bear to be seen, could not bear to be judged. And I would spend hours alone in my room, staring at the wall, feeling nothing but a vast, empty numbness that was somehow worse than the pain. Because at least the pain was a feeling, at least the pain meant I was still alive, but the numbness, the emptiness, the complete and utter absence of any emotion at all, was the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced. Because it made me wonder if I was even real anymore, if I was just a shell, a hollowed-out version of the woman I used to be. And there were nights when I would lie awake next to Tom, listening to him breathe, and I would think, if I disappeared tomorrow, would anyone even notice? Would anyone even care? Or would they just move on, relieved that the difficult foreigner was finally gone? And that thought, that dark, poisonous, self-destructive thought, was the closest I ever came to giving up entirely, to accepting that I was a failure, that I did not belong here, that I should just go home and admit defeat. And I remember one specific night, a cold, rainy, miserable night in November, when I had just gotten into another argument with Margaret on the phone, another argument about how I was raising my children, another argument about how I was not American enough, not good enough, not worthy enough. And I hung up the phone and just sat there, trembling, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the receiver. And Tom came into the room and said, "What happened? What did she say?" And I looked at him, and all the anger, all the frustration, All the despair that I had been bottling up for months exploded out of me like a volcano, and I screamed, "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep fighting your mother. I can't keep trying to be someone I'm not. I can't keep pretending that I'm okay when I'm falling apart inside. I just can't do it anymore." And Tom looked at me, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock, and he said, "Then don't. Just stop. Stop trying to please her. Stop trying to be perfect. Just be yourself. That's all I've ever wanted. That's all I've ever asked for." And I looked at him and I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that he really meant it, that he really accepted me exactly as I was. But I could not, because I had spent so long hiding, so long pretending, so long trying to be someone I was not, that I did not even know who the real me was anymore. I did not know what I wanted, what I needed, what I believed. I was just a confused, lost, broken woman who had no idea how to put herself back together. And that realization, that terrible, devastating realization, was the moment I hit rock bottom, the moment I finally understood that I could not keep going like this, that something had to change, that I had to find a way to save myself, to reclaim my identity, to remember who I was before I came to this country and tried to become someone else. And the answer, the unexpected, unlikely, slightly absurd answer, came to me in a dream about my grandmother. A dream where she was standing in her kitchen, stirring a giant pot of fish sauce, and she looked at me with those wise, knowing eyes and said, "You have forgotten who you are, child. You have forgotten that you are a daughter of the river, a child of the rice fields, a woman who carries the strength of 1,000 generations. You have forgotten that your food is your power, your love is your weapon, and your difference is your gift. Now go back to the kitchen, pick up your pot, and remind them all who you really are." And I woke up with a start, my heart pounding, and I knew exactly what I had to do. I knew that the only way to save myself, to save my marriage, and embrace the one thing that had always made me feel whole, the one thing that had always connected me to my ancestors, the one thing that had always given me strength, and that thing was cooking, but not just any cooking, not the compromised, watered-down, Americanized cooking I had been doing to please Margaret, but the real, authentic, unapologetic cooking of my grandmother. The cooking that smelled like fish sauce and garlic and caramelized sugar, the cooking that told the story of my people. And I knew that I had to share that cooking with Margaret. I had to invite her into my kitchen and show her who I really was, not the polite, deferential, apologetic foreigner she thought she knew, but the fierce, proud, passionate Vietnamese woman who had survived war and poverty and exile, and was not going to let a little thing like a disapproving mother-in-law break her spirit. And I knew that this would be the most important meal of my life. The meal that would either save my family or destroy it. And I was terrified, absolutely terrified, but I was also determined because I had hit rock bottom, and when you hit rock bottom, the only way to go is up, and I was ready to climb, even if it meant climbing over a mountain of fish sauce and family drama to get there. Whisper from the past, fish sauce as a secret weapon. Now, let me tell you about the phone call that changed everything. The call that brought me back from the brink of despair and reminded me that I was not just a struggling immigrant wife, but a warrior with a secret weapon, a weapon that had been passed down through generations of strong, resilient women, a weapon that smelled like fermented fish and tasted like love, and that weapon was my grandmother's fish sauce, the same humble, stinky, magical condiment that had been the backbone of Vietnamese cuisine for centuries, and I remember picking up the phone with trembling hands, dialing the international code for Vietnam, and listening to the familiar, crackling sound of the long-distance connection. And when my mother's voice finally came through the line, warm and familiar and filled with the kind of unconditional love that only a mother can give, I burst into tears, not the quiet, controlled tears I had been holding back for months, but the ugly, heaving, gasping sobs of a woman who had been carrying a crushing weight alone for far too long, and my mother, who had known me since I was a tiny, squalling infant, who had seen me through every triumph and every failure of my life, did not panic, did not interrupt, did not try to fix me. She just listened to my sobs and my stutters and my broken, desperate English, and when I finally managed to choke out the words, "Mom, I don't know if I can do this anymore. I don't know if I belong here. I don't know if I'm strong enough." She was silent for a moment, and then she said, in that calm, steady, unwavering voice that had guided me through every crisis of my life, "You are stronger than you know, my daughter. You are a child of the river, a descendant of warriors. You have survived floods and famines and wars that would have broken lesser people. You can survive a mother-in-law. But you have forgotten the most important lesson I ever taught you. You have forgotten the power of your grandmother's fish sauce." And I laughed, a wet, choked, slightly hysterical laugh, because it seemed so absurd that a bottle of fermented fish juice could solve the problems that had been tearing my life apart. But my mother was not joking. She was dead serious, and she said, "Listen to me carefully. Your grandmother used to say that fish sauce is the blood of our ancestors. It is the essence of our culture, the soul of our cooking, the secret ingredient that makes everything better." And when she was a young bride, her mother-in-law hated her. She was from a different village, a different family, a different way of cooking, and her mother-in-law thought she was not good enough, not proper enough, not worthy enough to marry her son. And your grandmother was miserable, just like you are now. She cried every night. She wanted to run away. But then she remembered her grandmother's recipe for caramelized fish, and she cooked it for the family, and the moment her mother-in-law tasted it, the moment that fish sauce hit her tongue, something shifted. She saw your grandmother not as a stranger, but as a woman who carried the wisdom of generations. And from that day on, they were not enemies, they were allies. So I am telling you now, my daughter, stop trying to be someone you are not. Stop hiding your culture, your cooking, your fish sauce. Embrace it. Share it. Let your mother-in-law taste your grandmother's love, and I promise you, the walls will start to crumble. And because I finally understood that I had been fighting the wrong battle, I had been trying to become American enough, perfect enough, acceptable enough, but the real battle was not about becoming someone else. It was about showing them who I really was. And the key to winning that battle was not hiding my fish sauce. It was sharing it proudly, boldly, unapologetically, and letting its pungent, glorious aroma do the work that my broken English could not. So I hung up the phone, took a deep breath, and walked into my kitchen. And I opened the cupboard where I kept my secret stash of Vietnamese ingredients, the treasures I had smuggled back from my last trip home. And I pulled out the bottle of fish sauce, the one that had traveled 8,000 miles to be with me, the one that had sat patiently on my shelf, waiting for its moment, and I held it up to the light, watching the amber liquid swirl inside the glass, and I thought about my grandmother, about her wrinkled hands, about her soft, weathered face, about the way she would hum as she stirred her pots, and I felt her presence beside me, guiding me, encouraging me, whispering in my ear, "You can do this, child. You have always been able to do this. You just forgot." And I started to plan, to strategize, to imagine the perfect meal that would bring Margaret to my table and finally break down the wall between us. And I knew that this meal had to be perfect, not just delicious, but meaningful. A meal that told the story of my people, a meal that honored my ancestors and my heritage and the long, difficult journey that had brought me to this country, and I decided on a classic Vietnamese dish. A dish that was simple enough to be approachable, but complex enough to be impressive. A dish that my grandmother had made for her own mother-in-law on the day she finally won her over, and that dish was kako too. The dish that had sustained my family through wars and famines and heartbreaks. The dish that was the very essence of Vietnamese home cooking. And I knew that if I could make it perfectly, if I could infuse it with all the love and history and hope that my grandmother had infused into hers, I might have a chance of reaching Margaret, a chance of showing her that I was not just a foreigner who had taken her son away, but a woman with a rich, beautiful, powerful culture of her own, a culture that was not inferior to hers, but simply different. And that difference was not a threat, it was a gift that I was finally ready to share. The next few days were a blur of preparation because I was not just cooking a meal, I was staging a revolution, a quiet, delicious, fish sauce-scented revolution that would either bring my family together or tear it apart, and I spent hours at the Asian market, carefully selecting the freshest fish, the most fragrant herbs, the perfect pieces of pork belly, the freshest chilies, and I walked through the aisles with a sense of purpose that I had not felt in months, a sense of mission that made me feel alive again. And I could feel the eyes of the other customers on me. The curious stares of Americans who had never seen a tiny Vietnamese woman so intensely focused on a bag of lemongrass. But I did not care. I did not care what they thought. I did not care if they judged me. I was on a mission to save my family with fish sauce. And nothing was going to stop me. When I got home, I laid out all my ingredients on the counter, and I started to cook, slowly, carefully, methodically, the way my grandmother had taught me, and I could feel her spirit in the kitchen with me, her hands guiding mine, her voice humming in my ear. And as the fish sizzled in the caramelized sugar, as the fish sauce bubbled and released its pungent, glorious aroma, as the garlic and chilies filled the air with their spicy, fragrant heat, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. A peace that I had not felt in months, because I was finally doing what I was born to do. I was cooking, I was creating, I was connecting with my ancestors, and I knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that this meal was going to change everything. This meal was going to be the turning point of my life, the moment when I finally reclaimed my identity and my power and my place in this world. And I could not wait to see Margaret's face when she tasted it. Betting everything, the night of cooking with all my heart. Now, I need you to understand the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what I was about to do, because this was not just a dinner party. This was not just a casual family gathering. This was the culmination of years of struggle, months of pain, and weeks of desperate, soul-searching preparation, and I was about to invite the woman who had made my life a living hell into my home, sit her down at my table, and serve her the most important meal of my entire existence. And if she rejected it, if she pushed her plate away with that familiar, disdainful sniff, I knew that my marriage, my family, my entire American dream would be over, because I had reached the point of no return. The point where I could no longer pretend, no longer compromise, no longer shrink myself to fit into someone else's expectations. And I was going to be myself, fully, completely, unapologetically myself, even if it meant risking everything. And that risk, that terrifying, exhilarating, all-or-nothing gamble, was the most alive I had felt in years, because I was finally taking control of my own destiny. And I was going to do it with a pot of caramelized fish and a bottle of stinky, glorious, ancestral fish sauce. The day of the dinner arrived, and I woke up before the sun, my stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and terror, and I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the ingredients I had carefully selected, and I started to cook, not with a frantic, anxious energy that had characterized my previous attempts to please Margaret, but with a calm, focused, almost meditative presence. Because I was not just cooking a meal, I was performing a ritual, a sacred act of connection with my ancestors, and every slice of the knife, Every stir of the pot, every sizzle of the fish hitting the caramelized sugar was a prayer. A plea to the spirits of my grandmother and my great-grandmother and all the strong, resilient women who had come before me. Closed-off American woman who had no idea what she was about to experience. I started with the caramel, the most important part of the dish, because the perfect caramel is the soul of kakao, and I melted the sugar slowly, carefully, watching it transform from white crystals to golden amber to a deep, rich mahogany, and I added the fish sauce, that pungent, magical elixir, and the moment it hit the hot caramel, the kitchen exploded with the most glorious, complex, intoxicating aroma I had ever created. A smell that was sweet and savory and salty and slightly funky all at the same time. A smell that transported me back to my grandmother's kitchen, to my childhood, to a place where I was loved and understood without having to explain myself. And I closed my eyes and breathed it in, feeling the stress and tension of the past months melt away, because in that moment, I was not the struggling immigrant wife. I was not the inadequate daughter-in-law. I was not the broken English speaker. I was a Vietnamese woman, a cook, a keeper of traditions. And I was about to share that tradition with a woman who desperately needed to understand it. The fish went into the pot, and I added the garlic, the chilies, the peppercorns, the scallions, each ingredient a note in a symphony of flavor that my ancestors had perfected over centuries, and I let it simmer, slow and low, letting the flavors meld and deepen and develop into something truly transcendent. And as the pot bubbled and the steam rose, I felt a wave of confidence wash over me, a confidence that I had not felt in years, because I knew with absolute certainty that this dish was perfect, this dish was magic, this dish was going to change everything, and I was not just hoping it would work, I knew it would, because fish sauce had never failed me. Fish sauce had never let me down. Fish sauce was the blood of my ancestors. And it had the power to unite even the most divided of families, and I thought about my grandmother, about the day she had made this same dish for her own mother-in-law, about the fear and hope she must have felt, about the triumph she must have experienced when her mother-in-law finally accepted her, and I felt a deep, powerful connection to her. A connection that transcended time and distance and culture, a connection that told me, you are not alone. You have never been alone. You carry the strength of all the women who came before you, and you are going to be just fine. By the time Margaret arrived at my door, the apartment was filled with the warm, inviting aroma of caramelized fish and garlic and chilies. An aroma that had already started to work its magic on my husband, who had been hovering around the kitchen all day, sneaking tastes and moaning with pleasure, and on my children, who had abandoned their toys and were sitting at the table, their little noses twitching with anticipation, and I opened the door to find Margaret standing there, her face carefully neutral, her arms crossed over her chest, and I could see the wariness in her eyes, the suspicion. Forced smile I had been giving her for years, but a genuine, warm, open smile, the smile of a woman who had nothing to prove and everything to share. And I said, "Welcome, Margaret. Please come in. I have made something special for you tonight, something that has been in my family for generations. And I hope you'll give it a chance." And she hesitated for just a moment, and then she stepped inside, and as the smell hit her, I saw a flicker of something cross her face, something that looked almost like curiosity, and I led her to the table, where the clay pot was waiting, steaming and fragrant, and I lifted the lid, and the steam rose up in a fragrant cloud, and Margaret leaned forward slightly, her nostrils flaring, and I could see her resistance faltering, her defenses weakening, because there is something primal and undeniable about the smell of good food, something that bypasses the rational mind and speaks directly to the heart. And she looked at me, her eyes soft, and she said, "It smells." It smells really good, actually. And I felt a surge of hope so powerful that I almost started crying because those were the first genuine, unguarded words she had ever spoken to me. The first crack in the wall that had stood between us for so long. And I served her a generous portion of the fish, with rice and pickled vegetables on the side, and I watched her, my heart pounding, as she lifted her chopsticks, as she brought the fish to her lips, as she took that first, tentative bite, and the moment the food hit her tongue, the moment the complex, layered flavors of caramel and fish sauce and garlic and chilies exploded in her mouth, I saw her face transform. The mask of suspicion and disapproval melting away to reveal something raw and real and beautiful, and she chewed slowly, thoughtfully. And then she looked at me, her eyes wide with surprise, and she said, This is incredible. I have never tasted anything like this. How did you make this? And I laughed, a joyful, relieved, triumphant laugh, because in that moment, I knew that the wall had finally come down, and everything was going to be okay. Mother-in-law holds chopsticks, the moment time stood still. Now, let me freeze that moment for you, because what happened next was so unexpected, so profound, so utterly transformative that I still have trouble believing it actually happened, and I need you to picture it with me, to really see it in your mind's eye, because this was the moment that changed everything, the moment when the impossible became possible, the moment when the woman who had been my nemesis, my tormentor, my personal symbol of American rejection, finally picked up her chopsticks and took a bite of my grandmother's caramelized fish, and in that single, suspended second, the entire universe seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next, and I watched her face with the intensity of a hawk, searching for any sign, any clue, any indication of whether this was going to be a victory or a defeat. And what I saw was something I had never seen before, something that made my heart skip a beat and my eyes fill with tears, because Margaret's face, that perfect, frozen, unreadable mask of Midwestern politeness, suddenly cracked, and beneath it, I saw something raw and real and vulnerable. Something that looked almost like wonder, and she chewed slowly, deliberately, savoring every single flavor, every layer of caramel and fish sauce and garlic and chilies, and she swallowed. And then she did something that I will never forget as long as I live. She looked at me, her eyes soft and wide, and she said, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, "This is the most delicious thing I have ever eaten in my entire life." And I just stood there, completely frozen, my brain struggling to process what I had just heard, because this was the same woman who had spent years criticizing my cooking, my culture, my very existence, and now she was sitting at my table, holding my chopsticks, eating my food, and telling me that it was the best thing she had ever tasted. And I felt a wave of emotion so powerful that I had to grab the edge of the table to steady myself. Because I had been fighting this battle for so long, had been carrying this weight for so many years, had been dreaming of this moment for so many sleepless nights, and now that it was finally here, now that the wall was finally crumbling, I did not know what to do with myself. I did not know how to process this sudden, miraculous shift, and I just stood there, tears streaming down my face, watching Margaret take another bite and another, eating my grandmother's recipe with a kind of reverence and appreciation that I had only ever dreamed of, and Tom, my sweet, wonderful, completely overwhelmed Tom, looked at me with such pride, such love, such relief in his eyes, and he whispered, "I told you, honey. I told you your cooking would win her over." And I laughed, a wet, choked, joyful laugh, because he had been right all along. He had believed in me when I could not believe in myself. He had seen the potential in me that I had been too blind and broken to see. And now, in this magical, impossible moment, everything was finally falling into place. The rest of the dinner was a blur of conversation and laughter and shared stories because Margaret, who had spent years treating me like a stranger, suddenly wanted to know everything about my childhood, my family, my traditions, my cooking, and she asked me questions in her slow, careful English, and I answered in my slow, careful English. And for the first time in our entire relationship, the language barrier was not a wall but a bridge that we were both willing to cross. A bridge that was bringing us closer together with every single word. And I told her about my grandmother, about the village where I was born, about the rice fields and the river and the street vendors who sold banh mi on every corner, and she listened, really listened, with her head tilted and her eyes focused. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "I think I finally understand, honey. I think I finally understand why my son fell in love with you. It's not just because you're beautiful or kind or a good mother. It's because you have this whole other world inside you, this rich, beautiful, ancient world that I've been too stubborn to see. And I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for all the ways I've made you feel unwelcome, for all the ways I've tried to make you small, for all the ways I've been a terrible mother-in-law, and I hope you can forgive me, because I would really, really like to be your friend." And I burst into tears, not the quiet, controlled tears of sadness, but the ugly, heaving, gasping sobs of pure, unadulterated relief, because I had been waiting for this moment for years, had been dreaming of this moment for years, had been praying for this moment for years, and now that it was finally here, I did not know how to contain the flood of emotions that was washing over me, and I just reached across the table and grabbed Margaret's hand, squeezing it tightly, and I said, "Of course I forgive you, Margaret. Of course I want to be your friend. I have always wanted to be your friend. I just didn't know how to reach you." And she squeezed my hand back, and in that moment, sitting around a table covered in empty bowls and chopsticks and the lingering aroma of fish sauce and garlic, the most unlikely friendship in the history of American-Vietnamese relations was born, a friendship built not on shared language or shared culture, but on shared food, shared love, and a shared willingness to finally understand each other. And the most beautiful part of this whole story, the part that still makes me smile every time I think about it, is that Margaret did not just stop at saying sorry. She actually started learning about my culture. She started asking me to teach her how to cook Vietnamese food. She started coming over to my house every Sunday for cooking lessons, and we would stand in my kitchen for hours, chopping and stirring and tasting and laughing, and her English got slower and more careful. And my English got faster and more confident, and we stopped worrying about grammar and pronunciation, and just focused on connecting, on sharing, on building a relationship that was based on mutual respect and genuine affection. And Tom would come home from work and find us in the kitchen, covered in flour and fish sauce and laughter, and he would just shake his head and say, "I can't believe this is happening. I can't believe my mother and my wife are actually friends." And I would smile and say, "Believe it, honey. Your mother has finally learned the secret ingredient." And he would ask, "What secret ingredient?" And I would look at him with a twinkle in my eye and say, "Fish sauce, baby. Fish sauce and a whole lot of love." From foes to allies, the mother-in-law asks for the recipe. Now, let me paint you a picture of what happened in the weeks and months after that magical dinner. Because the transformation that took place was nothing short of miraculous, a slow, beautiful, sometimes awkward, but always genuine evolution that turned my worst enemy into my closest ally, and I want you to see it, to really feel it. Because this is the part of the story that proves that change is possible, that hope is never lost, and that even the most stubborn walls can be broken down with enough patience, enough love, and enough fish sauce. And it all started the very next morning, when my phone rang at 8 a.m. and I saw Margaret's name on the caller ID, and I felt a jolt of panic. Because my brain was still conditioned to associate her name with criticism and conflict, but when I answered, her voice was not cold or clipped or judgmental. It was warm and hesitant and almost shy, and she said, "Good morning, honey." And I was so shocked that I almost dropped the phone because this was the same woman who had spent years pretending my culture did not exist. The same woman who had refused to even learn how to pronounce the names of my dishes. And now she was calling me, asking me for the Vietnamese name of my grandmother's recipe, and I felt a surge of joy so powerful that I could barely speak. And I said, "It's called Ca Co to Margaret. It's my grandmother's recipe. It's been in my family for generations," and I heard her repeat it slowly, carefully, "Ca Co to," and she stumbled over the tones, but she was trying. She was really trying, and I thought my heart might burst with happiness, and she said, "I want to learn how to make it. I want you to teach me. I know I've been difficult. I know I've made things hard for you, but I want to change. I want to understand your culture. I want to be a real grandmother to your children, and I think the best way to do that is to learn how to cook the food that you love." And I just stood there in my kitchen, tears streaming down my face, holding the phone with trembling hands, and I said, "I would love to teach you, Margaret. I would love nothing more." And that was the beginning of our weekly cooking lessons, a tradition that would transform our relationship and create bonds that I never thought possible. And every Sunday, without fail, Margaret would show up at my door with a notebook and a pen, ready to learn, ready to listen, ready to immerse herself in the flavors and techniques of Vietnamese cooking, and we would stand side by side in my kitchen, chopping garlic and mincing lemongrass and stirring pots of bubbling caramel, and I would teach her not just the recipes, but the stories behind them, the history of each dish, the memories and emotions that were woven into every single ingredient, and she would listen with such rapt attention, such genuine curiosity, that I felt like I was finally being seen, finally being heard, finally being appreciated for who I really was. And the language we used during these lessons was a beautiful, messy, glorious blend of English and Vietnamese and hand gestures and facial expressions and laughter. Because there were so many words that didn't translate, so many flavors that didn't have names in English, so many techniques that could only be demonstrated, not explained, and we would laugh at our mistakes, at my broken English and her clumsy chopstick skills, and we would celebrate our successes, the perfect caramel, the tender fish, the fragrant broth. And with every lesson, with every shared meal, the wall between us grew smaller and smaller until it finally disappeared entirely. And we became not just mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, but friends, real friends who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, who looked forward to seeing each other, who missed each other when we were apart, and it was the most beautiful, unexpected, miraculous gift I had ever received, a gift that I knew I would cherish for the rest of my life. And the children, my precious, beautiful children, they were the biggest beneficiaries of this transformation because they grew up watching their grandmother and their mother cook together. They grew up surrounded by the smells of both American and Vietnamese cuisine. They grew up learning that love was not limited by language or culture or nationality. My little girl with her father's blue eyes and my grandmother's stubborn chin, she would sit on the counter and watch us cook, and she would say, "Grandma, why does the fish sauce smell so funny?" And Margaret would laugh and say, "It smells funny because it's magic, sweetheart. It's the magic that brought our family together." And I would look at them, at this beautiful, improbable, perfectly imperfect family that I had somehow managed to create, and I would feel a gratitude so profound that it almost knocked me off my feet. A gratitude for the struggles and the tears and the sleepless nights, because without them, I would never have discovered the strength that was always inside me, the strength that had been passed down from my grandmother to my mother to me. The strength that had survived wars and famines and exile, the strength that had finally broken through the hardest wall in America. And Margaret, my former nemesis, she became my biggest cheerleader, my most loyal supporter, my fiercest defender. And she would tell everyone who would listen about her Vietnamese daughter-in-law who made the most incredible food. And she would brag about how she had learned to make pho and spring rolls and caramelized fish. And she would say, "My daughter-in-law is a genius, an artist, a treasure." And I was so stupid to ever doubt her. And I would blush and wave my hands and say, "Margaret, you're embarrassing me." But secretly, I loved it. I loved every single word, because I had spent so many years feeling invisible, feeling inadequate, feeling like I would never be good enough. And now, here I was, not just accepted, but celebrated, not just tolerated, but loved. And that love, that hard-won, battle-tested, fish sauce-soaked love, was the greatest victory of my entire life. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that if I could overcome the barriers between Margaret and me, I could overcome anything, because I had proven to myself that I was stronger than I thought, braver than I believed, and more resilient than I ever could have imagined. And the lesson I learned through this whole journey, the lesson I want to share with you, is that language is not just about words. It's about connection. It's about the willingness to be vulnerable, to make mistakes, to laugh at yourself, and to keep trying even when it feels impossible, because the people who truly matter, the people who are worth fighting for, will see your effort, your sincerity, your heart, and they will meet you halfway. They will learn your language, even if it's just the language of food, the language of love, the language of fish sauce. And that language, that universal, transcendent language, is the one that will always bring you home. Happiness in the kitchen and the lesson for myself. Now, let me bring you to the present, to the kitchen where this entire story began, because today, as I stand here stirring a pot of my grandmother's caramelized fish, surrounded by the familiar, comforting aroma of fish sauce and garlic and caramelizing sugar, I am not the same woman who stepped off that plane in Michigan all those years ago, freezing and terrified and utterly alone. I am someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more grateful. Because I have learned that the greatest battles we fight are not against other people, but against our own fears, our own insecurities, our own belief that we are not good enough, not strong enough, not worthy enough to belong. And I have learned that the weapons we need to win those battles are not always the ones we expect. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon is a bottle of fish sauce, a family recipe, and a willingness to be vulnerable, to make mistakes, to stumble and fall and get back up again. And I think about my grandmother, about the day she stood in her own kitchen, making this same dish, hoping against hope that her mother-in-law would finally accept her, and I feel a deep, profound connection to her, a connection that transcends time and distance and culture, a connection that reminds me that I am part of something bigger than myself, a chain of strong, resilient women who have faced impossible odds and somehow, against all expectations, managed to not just survive, but thrive. And I look around my kitchen now, at the beautiful chaos of my life, at my children playing in the living room, at my husband reading the newspaper at the table, at Margaret, my mother-in-law, my former nemesis, now my closest friend, sitting at the counter with her notebook open, ready to learn the next recipe. And I feel a wave of gratitude so powerful that it brings tears to my eyes, because this is not the life I expected. This is not the life I planned. This is not the life I thought I wanted when I left Vietnam all those years ago, but it is the life I needed, the life that taught me who I really am, the life that showed me that love can conquer even the deepest divides. And I know that the journey was not easy, the obstacles too insurmountable, But I also know that every single tear, every sleepless night, every awkward conversation, every humiliating mistake was worth it because it led me here, to this kitchen, to this family, to this moment of perfect, imperfect happiness. And I think about all of you watching this video right now, all of you who are struggling with your own English, your own cultural barriers, your own difficult relationships, and I want you to know that I see you, I understand you, and I believe in you because if I can do this, if I can go from a terrified, lonely immigrant who could barely string a sentence together to a woman who is not just accepted, but celebrated, who has built a family and a community and a life in a country that was once so foreign and frightening, then you can do it too. You can overcome whatever obstacles are standing in your way. You can break down whatever walls are keeping you from the life you deserve. And you can do it not by becoming someone else, not by hiding who you are, not by pretending to be more American or more perfect or more anything, but by embracing exactly who you are, by sharing your culture, your food, your stories, your heart, and trusting that the right people will see the beauty in your difference, the strength in your struggle, and the love in your offering. Because the truth is, we are all just trying to connect. We are all just trying to be seen and heard and understood. And the language we speak, whether it is English or Vietnamese or the language of food and love and shared meals, is just the tool we use to build those connections. And the most important thing is not how fluent we are, but how willing we are to try, to make mistakes, to be vulnerable, and to keep showing up day after day, even when it feels impossible. And I want to leave you with one final story, a story that happened just last week, when Margaret and I were cooking together, and she turned to me with a mischievous smile and said, "You know, I was thinking, maybe for Thanksgiving this year, we should make a Vietnamese-American feast, a real fusion, with turkey and pho and caramelized fish and pumpkin pie. And everyone will be so confused and so happy." And I laughed, a deep, joyful belly laugh. The same woman who had tried to erase my culture from her family's life, and now she was proposing a Vietnamese-American Thanksgiving. A celebration of everything we had been through, everything we had overcome, everything we had built together, and I looked at her, this woman who had once been my enemy and was now my ally, and I said, "That sounds perfect, Margaret. That sounds like the best Thanksgiving ever." And as we started planning the menu, I thought about how far we had come, how many walls we had broken down, how many bridges we had built, and I realized that this was the real happy ending, not a perfect, conflict-free fairy tale, but a messy, complicated, beautiful reality where two people from completely different worlds had found a way to love and respect and understand each other. Not despite their differences, but because of them, and that is the lesson I want to leave with you. The lesson that I have learned through this incredible, improbable fish sauce-soaked journey. The things that make us different are not weaknesses. They are strengths. The things that make us struggle are not obstacles. They are opportunities. And the things that make us afraid are not walls. They are doors, waiting for us to be brave enough to open them, and I hope that my story has inspired you to open your own doors, to share your own culture, your own food, your own heart, and to trust that the people who truly matter will meet you on the other side, ready to learn, ready to grow, ready to love you for exactly who you are because you are enough, you have always been enough, and you're broken. Imperfect, beautiful English is not a barrier to connection. It is a bridge that can carry you across any divide, a bridge that can lead you home. And as I stand here in my kitchen, surrounded by the people I love, the smells of my ancestors, and the sounds of my adopted country, I know that I am exactly where I am supposed to be, and I know that you will find your place too, your community, your family, your home, if you just keep cooking, keep speaking, keep loving, and never, ever give up, because the best things in life are worth fighting for, and you are worth every single bit of that fight. So go out there, share your fish sauce. and watch the walls come tumbling down. Now, as I stand here in my kitchen, surrounded by the lingering aroma of fish sauce and garlic and caramelized sugar, I want you to pause for just a moment and think about your own life, your own struggles, your own impossible walls, because I know you have them. I know you are facing something right now that feels insurmountable, a language barrier, a cultural divide, a difficult relationship, a dream that seems too far away. And I want you to know that the secret ingredient you are looking for is not out there in some textbook or language app or perfect American accent. It is inside you. It has always been inside you, waiting for you to be brave enough to use it. And my grandmother's fish sauce taught me that the things that make us different, the things that make us strange, the things that make us smell funny and speak funny and cook funny are not weaknesses, they are superpowers. Because they are the essence of who we are, the stories of our ancestors, the flavors of our homeland, the music of our hearts. And when we share them, when we offer them to the world with courage and vulnerability and love, we create connections that transcend language, that transcend culture, that transcend every wall that has ever been built. And I want you to remember that your broken English, your heavy accent, your strange food, your foreign traditions, they are not barriers to belonging, they are bridges, beautiful, unique. We'll cross them, they will meet you halfway, they will learn your language, even if it is just the language of a shared meal, because love, real love, does not care about perfect grammar. Real love cares about intention, about effort, about the willingness to try, and I promise you, if you keep cooking, keep speaking, keep showing up, keep being exactly who you are, you will find your people, your community, your home. Just like I found mine. In the most unexpected place, with the most unexpected person, over a pot of fish sauce that smelled like home. And I want you to know that I am rooting for you, I am cheering for you, I am believing in you, because if I could do it, if I could go from a terrified, lonely immigrant who could barely say hello without crying, to a woman who is surrounded by love and laughter and the glorious chaos of a blended family, then you can do it too. You can overcome whatever is standing in your way. You can break down whatever walls are keeping you from the life you deserve. And you can do it not by becoming someone else, but by becoming more fully, more completely, more unapologetically yourself. Because that is the only person you were ever meant to be, and that is the only person who can ever truly belong. And as I look around my kitchen now, at my husband, at my children, at Margaret, my mother-in-law, my friend, my ally, I know that this is not the end of my story. It is just the beginning, and there are so many more meals to cook, so many more bridges to build, so many more walls to break down. And I am so excited to share that journey with all of you because we are in this together. We are all just trying to find our way home. And I want you to know that you are not alone. You have never been alone, and you will never be alone. Because there is a whole community of people out there who are struggling just like you, who are fighting just like you, who are hoping just like you. And together, we can break down every wall, build every bridge, and create a world where everyone belongs, where everyone is seen, where everyone is loved, exactly as they are, fish sauce and all. So please, if this story touched you, if it made you laugh or cry or feel a little less alone, I want to invite you to join this community, to subscribe to this channel. So many more lessons about language and love and life, and I want you to be part of it. I want you to share your own stories, your own struggles, your own triumphs, because your voice matters, your story matters, you matter, and together, we can create something beautiful, something powerful, something that will break down walls and build bridges and bring people together, one fish sauce bottle at a time. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button right now, leave a comment telling me about your own impossible wall and how you plan to break it down, and I promise you, I will read every single one because you are not just a viewer to me, you are family, and family sticks together, through thick and thin, through fish sauce and meatloaf, through broken English and perfect silence, and I cannot wait to see what we build together. So thank you for being here, thank you for listening, thank you for believing, and remember, the secret ingredient was always you. It was always you. That is all for today. I will make more videos like this in the future. Please subscribe to watch them.